Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, which sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And today we'll talk about safety campaigns, specifically how they can lead to dangerous outcomes. As an example, let's talk about highway signs, electronic safety message signs on highways. You've probably seen them lots of American highways if you drive, they're everywhere. And they usually talk about the consequences of bad driving. Watch out for motorcycles or something like that. Pretty frequently, the electronic safety signs that change, they say, hey, here's how many people were killed so far this year in this state, so usually state-based. So the number of driving-related deaths per year in the state. And of course, that number increases throughout the year. So that's another type of message. That's another type of safety campaign. Watch out for motorcycles is one campaign. Buckle up is another campaign. Click it or ticket, meaning to wear your safety belt. Don't drive drunk. There's another type of safety campaign. And this safety campaign with the number of deaths is very, very frequent. Now, what's the assumption behind these safety signs? Well, the common assumption when you think about it, right, what it seems intuitive is that these signs reduce fatalities, right? Makes sense that specifically with the driving deaths per year, as they increase throughout the year, people should drive more carefully if they see that others are killed. And especially as they see people are killed more throughout the year, if it's like 0 people killed in January of 1st and maybe one person killed on New Year drunk driving, or a couple people, and then throughout the year 100 people killed by March or something like that, and 300 killed by May, and by October maybe 1100 killed or something like that. And so presumably the more people are listed, the more people should pay attention to the signs and not drive in such a way that would cause them to be killed, right? That makes sense. Well, that's armchair psychology. That's intuitive psychology. And sometimes what seems to make sense to us doesn't actually work in practice. It's often unsubstantiated by the research in cognitive science. It's the result of intuitive gut reactions, what we feel works, rather than what actually works. And so that's due to cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors that our minds make because of how they're wired, that don't really reflect how reality works. And so that's bad decision making. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about a study that came out recently studying the impact of safety signs. This was a major study, examined 7 years worth of data, so a lot of data, on a campaign that was going on in Texas for 1 week each month. So each month there was a week of the month that specifically showed the fatalities that week. And during other weeks of the month, the signs showed other messages like don't drive drunk, click it or ticket, watch out for motorcycles, and so on, other messages. So the nice thing about electronic safety signs is that they can vary their messages. And so during 1 week each month, that campaign, the safety campaign, was specifically focused on fatalities in Texas so far this year. So 1 week each month. So there are 880 electric highway signs in Texas that this study looked at, which showed the number of these motor deaths in the state per year. And what the study found, so 880 signs in Texas for a campaign that ran 1 week each month. So that's nice because it provides a natural experiment comparing it to other weeks, right? So presumably if you have a week in September, 1 week in September is going to look much like another week in September. It's not going to be extremely different. And if there was some differences, that they will generally balance out throughout the year. So it's not like, it was all concentrated, the safety campaign during 1 month when you might have unusual driving compared to other months, like summer holidays or something like that, when people drive more. No, it was just steadily throughout the year. That's what was clearly happening. And so you can compare what was happening during that week of the month, let's say the week of the month of March when it ran, you can compare it to the other weeks in March when it didn't run. And you can compare the week in October that the safety campaign ran to the other weeks in October when it didn't run. So a very good experiment. And what the study found was that the number of crashes increased by 1.5%, 1.52% within 3 miles of the signs during the safety campaign weeks. So think about it. Your goal is to decrease crashes, right? That's the point. You're thinking, well, if I have those signs, then people will drive more safely. That's the intuitive armchair psychology. That's how it feels it should work. But what the study found was that the signs with the number of fatalities on average increased crashes by 1.52% within 3 miles of the signs. So that is, and that's during the weeks of the safety campaign, of course. So that's really, really bad. That's the opposite of what you want, right? That's the point. That's the opposite of what you want. So when the signs didn't show fatality information, there were less crashes. When the signs showed fatality information, there were more crashes during during that 1 week per month when the fatality signs were showing. So that's clearly a cause of the signs, and that is a huge problem, especially because it's not simply Texas. I mean, many states do the same campaigns. I'm here in Columbus, Ohio, go Bucks, right? And we here use the same things. I see those fatality signs on highways all the time saying, 300 people killed so far this year, 600 people killed so far this year, whatever, all that sort of stuff. Now, the crashes, the consequence, what is the reasoning? Why does that happen? Why does it go against our intuitions, what we feel should happen? It's distracted driving. That's the problem. That drivers are distracted by the signs. And so the attention is grabbed by the signs, and it causes drivers to be distracted as a result of the signs. So people feel anxious, they see the signs, and that leads to an increase in the number of deaths. So that's a big problem. The distracted driving is what leads to deaths. The anxiety, so people see the signs, they feel anxious, and then they see more deaths. Now, how do we know this? How do we know that that's what's actually going on, that it's people's anxiety? Well, the really cool thing about this experiment, or a really helpful thing that helps demonstrate that it's the anxiety that people experience, is that the number of crashes grows throughout the year. So the percentage of crashes, so again, it's 1.52% on average throughout the year, more within 3 miles of the signs after seeing the sign with the fatality message. But the percentage grows throughout the year. So that is really crucial because you see a higher count. So let's say by the end of January, there's a pretty low crash rate. In fact, you see that the signs cause a decrease in crash rates overall in January because there are so few people listed on the sign. So, 10 people killed. So people aren't as distracted, aren't as anxious, and the sign actually works to trigger them to drive more carefully. So they actually have a positive effect. So they decrease crashes. But as the number of people listed as killed on the signs increases throughout the year, the percentage of crashes increases. So it goes from less crashes to more crashes. And so by the end of the year, it's something like 3-ish% that, so pretty high increase in crashes compared to the other weeks. And so we can clearly see that the percentage of crashes, it's not the weather, because very clearly we see that it resets again in January to a very low rate. So that's a reset. So there's a sharp break between December, when there's a very significant increase, quite a bit more than 1.5%, 5-2%, it's 3% something in December, and then in January it drops to -1% or something like that, crashes. So it's not the weather, it's not anything like that, it's just a number of people listed as killed on the sign and the anxiety that causes. So that is really critically important. And that, of course, shows that it is specifically the signs and specifically the listing of the people killed, the number of people killed who are listed there, is what causes people to be anxious and distracted and then cause crashes. So and we also know another thing about the crashes is that most of the crashes that happen are multiple car crashes. And that is typically multiple car crashes happens when people are somewhat distracted. When people are strongly distracted, what happens is an increase both in single car crashes and in multiple car crashes. But when people are somewhat distracted, there's an increase in multiple car crashes because it's much easier to have a multiple car crash than a single car crash. So you have to be substantially more distracted to have a single car crash. The social costs. So this campaign has a lot of social costs. The annual cost, the social costs, is that it causes this 1.52% increase in crashes on average has a social cost overall burden of $377 million per year. So $377 million per year. That's because it leads to 2,600 more crashes overall and 16 more deaths of those 2,600 crashes. And of course, 16 more deaths, but a whole bunch of people injured and cars wrecked. So that's the social costs. And this is just Texas. So we're talking only about Texas. Like I said, many other states conduct similar safety campaigns. Other studies show more evidence for why this study's conclusions are accurate. So we have another study showing that driving quality gets worse as people get more anxious. So as people get more anxious, we have clear research showing that people drive worse because they're distracted, right? So a different study we have shows that messages showing death count, how many people died, do cause anxiety. So we have a study that's showing that one study shows that messages that listing how many people died so far that year causes anxiety. We have a separate study showing that, well, if people feel anxiety, they drive worse. So that provides further support for the conclusions of this study that the highway signs, cause a great increase in crashes, 2,600 more crashes with 16 more deaths with a social cost of $377 million. That's pretty huge. This phenomenon, the broader phenomenon that we're talking about, is called the boomerang effect. The boomerang effect. That is a mental phenomenon when an intervention, so it's an intervention, produces an effect opposite to what was intended. This is discussed in psychology. So this is a psychological phenomenon when you are trying to get an intervention done and it produces an effect that's the opposite of what you wanted to do. Like, of course, increasing the number of crashes. This happens pretty often. And of course, you would not be thinking about, well, interventions create boomerang effects, but they create them pretty frequently. I'll give you another example. Talk about public health, right? There was a national youth anti-drug media campaign done in 1994, late 1990s, early 2000s. So there was marketing targeted at youths aged 9 to 18 with anti-drug messaging, especially targeting marijuana. So the US Congress dedicated $1 billion, so that's a lot of money, to this campaign between 1998 and 2004. And there was a study of this, so study of the impact. So the 2008 study funded by the National Institutes of Health, it found that indeed the campaign was effective in exposing youth, that on average youth got exposed to 2 to 3 ads per week. And on average, getting more exposure to this campaign, the more exposed youth tended to be, made people more likely to use marijuana, not less. So people were more likely to use marijuana as a result of getting exposure to this campaign. So the Congress, $1 billion, caused more people youth 9 to 18 to use marijuana. Why? That seems weird, right? You would think that it should cause less youth to use marijuana. Well, the thing is, the study found that youths who saw the ads, they got the impression, the feeling, that their peers used marijuana widely, and therefore, well, I should use marijuana myself because my peers use it, right? Based on those advertisements that they saw. That's a boomerang effect. Just like people feeling anxious, so that feeling of anxiety after seeing the signs with the highway crashes, fatalities so far, caused them to be more likely to crash, though the sign was intended to cause them to be less likely to crash. People who saw the ads were more likely to use marijuana on average because they felt that the ads conveyed to them that their peers used marijuana, right? Again, armchair psychology. So obviously Congress and the designers of the ads thought that the ads would cause youth to use less marijuana, but they followed the practices of armchair psychology. They used their intuitions. They didn't actually research what works well and what doesn't work well. Just like the highway safety signs didn't research what actually works well and what doesn't work well. And there are plenty of other situations, not simply in public policy, like the highway safety or drug campaign, but let's talk about tech. So Apple, the company, launched a major advertising campaign promoting remote work using its tools, not for its staff, but using its tools. The Apple, all the Apple products, right? Hardware and software. But a week before the ad campaign went live, Apple forced staff to return to the office 3 days a week. So announced the forced return to the office a week before the ad campaign went live. Announced this forced return to the office, kind of a timeline, like in 2 months you have to return to the office. And then the ad campaign went live. Now, how do you think it made staff feel when they saw the ad campaign that, hey, use Apple products to work remotely, it's great. And Apple itself forcing its staff to come to the office. Of course, Apple was targeting its consumers, its clients, not the staff, its customers, not the staff with the ad campaign. But of course, the staff saw the ad campaign and they were pretty outraged. So a number resigned, many protested and opposed this. A number resigned, including the top executive, the head of Apple's AI division, who explicitly said that he resigned because of Apple's inflexible policy toward remote work. So, why do these sorts of interventions fail, whether in public policy or in private policy, private approaches like in the Apple case? Well, because people don't do nudges well. You might have heard of the term nudge, which is a non-coercive method to shape one's environment and influence people's behavior in a predictable manner. So leaders try to nudge the opinion of subordinates, and public policymakers try to nudge the opinions of the citizens, and of course companies try to nudge the opinions of customers and staff. Unfortunately, using armchair psychology, they don't actually consult the research on how to do nudges well. They don't consult behavioral scientists. They use armchair psychology, their intuitions of what should work. So they fall for these cognitive biases, these dangerous judgment errors, not realizing that they'll often end up with something like the boomerang effect, instead of talking to behavioral scientists to help design and test campaigns. Now, how do you address this problem? How do you make better interventions? Well, you won't be surprised that you really should consult behavioral science experts on nudges before launching your intervention, right? That seems, now that we're talking about this, pretty clear that if you don't want the boomerang effect in pretty serious matters that are pretty deadly, I mean, literally life and death with the highways, right? That is, or public health with the marijuana, you want to consult behavioral science experts. And then you want to conduct small-scale testing interventions before wide rollout. So as a behavioral scientist, I'll tell you that I can't absolutely predict the effects of something. I can, forecast that something is more likely to work or less likely to work. But what I'll tell you is I'm not a perfect predictor of people's behaviors and opinions. So what you'll want to do is do a number of experiments and try out a number of things, and then do those small-scale tests before rolling out an intervention on a large scale. So maybe look at something like a couple of dozen roadway safety signs in some representative areas of Texas for a couple of months and see what kind of impacts the various messaging on them would have to increase or decrease fatalities, right? Look at it throughout the scope of a year, because it would change, of course, throughout the year, and then roll it out based on that evaluation. So the realizing rollout based on testing and what you can do to do this. So this is what you want to do. And this is an example. And of course, the same thing for messaging for public health. You want to first, for marijuana messaging, you want to first do the messaging on a small scale, maybe in a couple of cities, and see the impact before rolling it out massively. So what can you do to help address this? Well, you can contact your elected officials and tell them to actually do a proper behavioral science-based study before rollout. So go against those gut reactions and armchair psychology and help make the best decisions for public policy in matters of health, in matters of life and death like highway safety, and all other sorts of issues. All right, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Again, I'm Dr. Gleb Tsipursky, and I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, which sponsors this podcast. Please leave a review with your thoughts. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and it helps other folks discover the show and gain the same benefits that you're getting from checking it out. Email me with your thoughts about the show at gleb, Gleb, at disasteravoidanceexperts.com. I'd love to have your thoughts, and it will enable me to make the show better. And of course, please subscribe to it. So whether you're checking it out on iTunes or YouTube, please subscribe to it so you make sure to get further episodes of the podcast. And check out the show notes, which have much more information about this topic with all the links for the studies that I described in the podcast. All right, everyone. I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. And in the meantime, the wisest and most profitable decisions to you, my friends.